Is China stealing American jobs? That's what Republicans and Democrats would have you believe as we head into the presidential elections. We'll discuss this myth and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, a news show produced in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of a country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee, and this is my co-host, KJ Noh. KJ, why don't you kick it off with the headlines this week?
Prime Minister Kishida, who militarized Japan at U.S. behest, to resign. Fumio Kishida, the Prime Minister of Japan, resigned due to lingering corruption allegations linked to the Unification Church, poor economic performance, and extremely low polls. Kishida militarized Japan, implementing the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and tying Korea and Japan to the JACUS military alliance. He also committed to doubling Japan's military budget in preparation for war with China. Kishida's party, the LDP, was built from a coalition of unrepentant Japanese war criminals, organized crime, corporate barons, with CIA funding and a boost from the Moonies. They have exercised near one-party control of the government since 1955. It's unknown who will replace Kishida at this point.
China rejects U.S. warmongering rhetoric in Asia. Beijing on Friday expressed its firm opposition to U.S. allegations of China as a military threat. According to National Defense Ministry spokesperson Colonel Zhang Xiaogang, Washington's accusation is a pretext to promote military ties and confrontation in Asia. Zhang stated that the United States uses its nuclear weapons as an instrument of coercion and to bind its allies, which demonstrates its intentions of nuclear domination globally. We know that the United States poses the greatest nuclear threat in the world. With the world's largest nuclear arsenal and a policy that allows for using nuclear weapons, Washington has invested in the miniaturization and operationalization of its nuclear weapons, Zhang noted.
Behind the pageantry of Shenyun, untreated injuries and emotional abuse, former members of Falun Gong's Shenyun dance troupe allege cult-like abuse. Shenyun is the dance troupe affiliated with the religious cult Falun Gong. Former performers of Shenyun claimed that there was a cult-like atmosphere that included refusal of medical care for injuries, threats, intimidation, and psychological abuse, low or no pay, and other cult-like abuses such as restriction of contact, travel, and use of media. Some performers were told that a mistake during a performance could condemn the audience to hell. Li Hongzhi, the founder of Falun Gong, has stated that cross-race marriage is a plot of aliens, and that gays and lesbians, people who use computers, and people who believe in modern science are evil. He also claimed the Earth is under attack from aliens. Falun Gong also owns the newspaper Epoch Times and the TV station New Tang Dynasty. Falun Gong seems to have borrowed the publicity template of the CIA-connected Unification Church cult, the Moonies, which also had their own dance companies, the Universal Ballet and Little Angels, and newspapers, the Washington Times and UPI.
China targets cryptocurrencies, online game coins in intensified money laundering crackdown. China's highest judicial bodies have declared cryptocurrencies, online game coins, and tipping during live streaming as money laundering. This marks the first instance of Beijing revising its laws to target the use of virtual assets. Virtual currency, game coins, internet platforms, and payments through live streaming have become new money laundering channels, showing more complex and hidden networking and chain-like characteristics, said a statement released by China's Supreme People's Court. Those found guilty could face between 5 and 10 years in prison and a minimum fine of 200,000 yuan, which is equivalent to 28,000 US dollars.
Chinese and Philippine ships collide in disputed waters, and the countries are trading blame. A Philippine Coast Guard ship, MRRV 4410, overtook, suddenly turned right, cut off, and rammed a Chinese Coast Guard vessel 21551 on August 9th at 3:25 in the morning in the South China Sea, in the waters of the Sabina Shoal near the Spratly Islands. Video footage confirms this sequence of events. Filipino journalist Ana Molindog-Uy speculated that this rash action was to distract from Marcos's domestic woes. It may also have to do with US war designs to provoke an incident to start a kinetic war in the South China Sea, which the US has wargamed out to be the most damaging to China and the most advantageous to the United States. British, French scholars and jurists and diplomats have asserted that the Spratlys and the Paracels belong to China starting from the 1880s. Chinese records go back 2,000 years asserting control and ownership of the islands. The Irish international law expert Anthony Carty asserts that the Philippine claims are an absurdity. A Filipino adventurer claimed the islands as his own country, Freedom Land, in 1955, based on the principle of terra nullius, the colonial era doctrine of discovery, then sold it to the Philippine government in 1972. Due to overlapping EEZs, multiple countries claim portions of the South China Sea. However, China has exercised caution in most of its interactions. Indonesia, a claimant to the South China Sea, has fired multiple times on other ships with bullets and has sunk 370 foreign ships.
China cracks down on unruly behavior of online fans. Since this year's Paris Olympics, Chinese authorities have ramped up efforts to crack down on unruly behavior in online fan communities. The move comes after the women's table tennis final on August 3rd, when online derogatory comments were made against some of the athletes and coaches, which created significant public outcry. Beijing police arrested a 29-year-old woman who confessed to making the offensive posts. The case remains under investigation. The Ministry of Public Security has urged online users to refrain from spreading misinformation or engaging in personal attacks online. The Chinese Table Tennis Association has expressed concerns over the disruptive behavior of online fan circles, which they say has negatively impacted the players, coaches, and staff. And now to our main story. As we head into the presidential elections, both parties are ramping up the China threat. One way they've been doing this is by returning to the trope that China is stealing American jobs while promising workers the return of U.S. manufacturing. A few weeks ago, J.D. Vance at the Republican National Convention told the audience, "We will protect the wages of American workers and stop the Chinese Communist Party from building their middle class on the backs of American citizens." But this idea is shared by Democrats as well. Biden has said previously that China is eating our lunch, and that the central plank of his economic policy is not too dissimilar from Trump's. It's a plan to counter China through rebuilding America's industrial base, investing in America, producing things in America, buying things in America. And Biden's economic policy also promises to bring back manufacturing that's moved overseas, especially electric vehicles and semiconductors. To discuss this, we are joined today by Ben Norton. Ben is a journalist based in China and the host of Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben, welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I like the program. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. This is a big topic and there's a lot to delve into. But first, maybe we can start it off with, the trope that China is stealing our jobs. Is China really stealing our jobs? If not, who is? And are these jobs really coming back?
Well, this is ridiculous on so many grounds. First of all, the idea that U.S. corporations were forced to go to China is ridiculous. I mean, this is an example of scapegoating China for the greed of U.S. corporations that wanted to exploit lower paid labor, not just in China, but across the global south. China did not invent outsourcing. In fact, China has always emphasized what it calls joint ventures, which is something that's almost never mentioned. That China, when it began the reform and opening up, starting in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese government's policy was what they refer to as technology transfer for market access. Technology for market. So the idea was, okay, we will allow foreign companies to invest in China, but under the condition that, one, they create a joint venture with a Chinese firm, that is half of it, or slightly over half, has to be owned by a Chinese company. And in return for getting access to the massive Chinese market, of course, today there are 1.4 billion people, making it its largest economy on earth. In return for that, these companies have to exchange their technology. It was not forced, because this also leads to this narrative that Western neoliberal economists use, claiming that China stole foreign technology or forced other companies. It was voluntary. It was a decision made by US companies and European companies to outsource their operations to another country. The US government encouraged this policy. This idea that China is stealing our jobs is outrageous. It was actually under Ronald Reagan in the 80s with the rise of neoliberalism, followed by Bill Clinton in particular. The US government encouraged these policies because the US government is funded by these very same corporations that profited from outsourcing labor, not only to China, but also to Bangladesh, to Indonesia, to Guatemala, I mean, many countries around the world, right? So the other important point to keep in mind here is that at this point, we can see that the US government is now reversing this and imposing many tariffs on Chinese companies. And the narrative that they're using is that China is unfairly competing. So, I mean, at every single level, first they say China took our jobs. Now they say China is unfairly competing. What they're saying essentially is that China is not allowed to have it's not allowed to produce any of these products that instead only US corporations should produce. But that's because at first it was Chinese labor being produced with products, Chinese labor being used to produce products from US companies or European companies. But now that they're Chinese companies, suddenly that's an issue. I mean, it's the clear double standard is that when US corporations are allowed to exploit this labor and can do so selling the products as US with a label from the United States or whatever, then it's fine. But now that there are Chinese competitors, well, then it's unfair competition.
Ben, so I mean, if we want to simplify, we can simply say that capital is at core. It's simply the power to command labor, to extract profits and surplus value. And capital will move around. If it can move around, it will go to where it can command the most labor because labor generates profit. And what we see here is that when we talk about China stealing your jobs, that's really a way of diverting from saying the truth, which is the capitalists stole your jobs. It's like that old joke. This guy sits at the table with a boss. There's a pizza. The guy eats 9 out of the 10 slices. And then he says to the guy, watch out for that Chinese person. He wants to steal your slice of pizza. So there's a way in which this is really, really absurd. But I think the other thing that we also want to think about is, global labor arbitration and unfair exchange. We know that 826 billion hours of labor were donated from the global south to the global north in 2021. That's the equivalent of 369 million workers doing 2,236 hours per worker per year in terms of what they contributed to the north. And we also have other statistics. We can look at the unfair exchange statistics from Jason Hickel, where he points out that China has given 18.76 trillion dollars worth of goods, or in its unequal exchange, to the global north, and that the U.S. has profited from this by 18.291 trillion from the global south. In other words, the Chinese did not steal from us. By any measure of looking at the numbers, we can clearly assert that if anybody was being taken, it was the Chinese. And even so, under those conditions, they pinched their pennies and were still able to develop.
That's absolutely right. I mean, 2 important points to say in response to that. One about unequal exchange, and one about why Chinese products tend to be much cheaper than a commensurate product made in a Western economy. So I'll start with the latter. First of all, So it's true that when the reform and opening up began in 1978, and China did allow some foreign investment to encourage industrialization, the Chinese leadership recognized that they really needed technology transfer. They needed to develop their own manufacturing capabilities to develop the productive forces. And they did so very rapidly through a state-led industrialization campaign, through a mixture of state-owned enterprises, which still comprise about 1/3 of China's GDP. These are government companies, and allowing some private investment, but in a controlled way. China still has capital controls, so they weren't allowing, just speculative foreign investment coming in to pump up bubbles of financial speculation. They were encouraging productive investment in areas of the economy that would lead to manufacturing and industrialization. The point is that was true at the beginning, that Chinese wages were very, very low because of the legacy of colonialism. Formerly colonized countries that were underdeveloped do not have industrial capabilities that can compete with Western companies. Therefore, their labor is much less competitive, less skilled. However, China has rapidly developed, and today, as I mentioned, China now has some of the most high-tech capabilities on Earth. And yet, products are still very competitive. Why is that? It's not just because Chinese labor is low paid. I mean, Chinese wages have risen a lot, in fact, significantly more than other countries in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, where there's a lot of manufacturing. Chinese wages are quite good. However, one of the reasons that Chinese goods are so competitive is because the Chinese government subsidizes production through the socialization of basic infrastructure, through the socialization of services that workers need. So all of the transportation in China is state-owned. All of the infrastructure construction comes from state-owned companies. All of the banking sector is state-owned. And state-owned banks provide very favorable low-interest rate loans to industries that encourage productive investment in manufacturing. The Chinese healthcare system is mostly non-for-profit and is exponentially cheaper than the US. I mean, it's just like nothing compared to how expensive the privatized U.S. health system is. The education system is public in China. So all of those costs that Western workers have to pay for out of their paycheck make anything that they would produce significantly less competitive internationally. It's not because China is engaged in unfair practices and stealing jobs and all of this. It's simply because the U.S. economy and Western neoliberal economies have been built in a way that makes production as expensive as possible, which only further incentivizes corporations to outsource their production abroad. And then the other part of this about unequal exchange is related to this. The US dollar is one of the most overvalued currencies on earth precisely because of the US dollar system that was created at the end of World War II, going back to the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, when the dollar was made the global reserve currency. This means that countries around the world need to get access to dollars if they want to pay for crucial imports, for commodities like, for instance, oil and gas, or foodstuffs, or minerals, or even capital goods and manufacturers. They need to get access to dollars largely because of the dominance of the US dollar. That significantly overvalues the dollar, and it tends to depreciate other currencies against the dollar. It weakens the currencies of countries that chronically rely on imports. The US has this exorbitant privilege where the US can simply import the wealth produced by workers around the world for free. The US government doesn't have to do anything. It can print dollars. And these days, the vast majority of dollars in existence are not physical. They are zeros, the decimals on a computer screen. So the US dollar can print trillions of dollars and import all of those products that is to say, suck in all of the surplus value produced by workers around the world. You mentioned the work of the political economist Jason Hickel, who's a very good political economist who's done a lot of work on unequal exchange. What's interesting about his research is he shows how this extraction of the surplus value of workers produced around the world, the super exploitation of global south workers, is not only facilitated by wage differentials, that is, the differences in wages between countries in the same area, same sectors, but also exchange rate differentials. That's what's unique about his research. So let me explain that for people briefly. So if you are a worker in the US or in Europe, in a high-income country that developed through colonialism and slavery, if you are, for instance, a restaurant worker, a waiter, you are probably paid, even though in the U.S. there's obviously basically no livable wage, minimum wage for restaurant workers, despite the difficulties they do face because of the very high cost of living in the U.S. They're still probably paid 5 to 10 more times than a similar restaurant worker in China or in another global south country. However, again, I mentioned that in China, many of the costs of living are socialized, but it's also because the Chinese yuan the U.S. would claim undervalued compared to the extremely overvalued U.S. dollar, meaning that you can buy much more with yuan than you can buy with U.S. dollars because the U.S. dollar is intentionally overvalued. So what this means is that neoliberal economists will claim that U.S. workers are 5 to 10 times more productive. That's ridiculous. Are we supposed to believe that restaurant workers produce 5 to 10 times more food in the U.S. than in China? Or, for instance, a sanitation worker does 5 to 10 times more work than a Chinese sanitation worker? No, it's because the dollar system was constructed in a way that intentionally inflates the dollar in order to protect the wealth of capitalists who store their wealth in the dollar. And what you see is that capitalists around the world, including in China, by the way, because the Communist Party disciplines capital and maintains capital controls and prevents them from engaging in speculation and building up big bubbles. So instead, capitalists around the world will try to offshore their wealth, and which is abstracted, the surplus value they extract, which they store in the form of some kind of currency, and then they invest that currency in some kind of asset that will give them a capital gain. So they invest that abstracted surplus value in the form of the US dollar in US real estate, in US government bonds, US debt, in US stocks that pump up the bubble of the US stock market. So what we see is that all of these wage differentials are ultimately rooted in the fact that the US has this free lunch based on its exorbitant privilege. It sucks in the surplus value produced by workers around the world, and capitalists try to store that in US assets, which depreciates the currency of values like the value of currencies like the yuan, and overvalues the value of the US dollar. So China did not create the system. The US created this system in a way that super exploits workers in the global south, that also hurts workers in the US because it led to deindustrialization, the loss of good jobs, and it makes the cost of living prohibitively expensive. No one can afford healthcare education because the dollar is so extremely overvalued, because they want to massively increase the price of real estate because rich people hold homes as a speculative asset, not as a place to live. So this hurts workers in the US, it hurts workers in the global south. The only people who benefit at the end of the day are capitalists who are invested in US assets on Wall Street.
Ben, the China is stealing our lunch, China is stealing our jobs talking point. It's often used by both parties, Republicans and Democrats, to rile up their base. But even they know that it's not true. I know you've seen this, but a few months ago in April, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, he had a speech at the Brookings Institution. And in this speech, he basically describes the factors which led to the hollowing out of the U.S. industrial base in the first place. And he explicitly said in the speech, it was not China that's stealing our jobs, but he said the vision of public, this is a quote, the vision of public investment that had energized the American project in the post-war years, and indeed for much of our history, had faded. It had given way to a set of ideas that championed tax cutting and deregulation, privatization over public action, and trade liberalization as an end in itself. And he goes on to say there was one assumption at the heart of all of this policy, that markets always allocate capital productively and efficiently, no matter what our competitors did, no matter how big our shared challenges grew, and no matter how many guardrails we took down. And he says explicitly in this speech that it's trickle-down economic policies that led to the loss of American manufacturing and the shrinking of the American middle class. Policies like regressive tax cuts, deep cuts to public investment, unchecked corporate concentration, and active measures to undermine the labor movement that initially built the American middle class. So this is a really interesting example of, what the ruling class says publicly to rile up their base versus, what they say in semi-private, what they know to be true. So just your thoughts on that speech, because I know you've seen it.
Yeah, this is actually a very important speech given by the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in 2023, because it reflects the fact that some figures in the U.S. ruling class recognize that neoliberalism is responsible for so many of the social problems faced by working people in the U.S., not because of China taking our jobs. So in this speech, he acknowledges that it led to de-industrialization of the U.S. because, again, this system incentivized U.S. companies to offshore their production, outsource their production to other countries where they can exploit labor because, again, of the overvalued dollar, the undervalued foreign currencies, and lower paid labor. Second of all, he in the speech argues that this free market fundamentalism has led to increasing inequality, which is objectively true, and political instability, which, this is something that people on the left have been saying for decades. Again, the U.S. government's policy for decades has been to intentionally inflate the value of assets, of real estate, of stocks, of bonds, in order to make the rich richer. And in the U.S. now, 93% of stocks are held by 10% of the population. So this is where the inequality comes from. And it's not some kind of fact of nature. It was an intentional policy in which the U.S. government, both administrations, Republicans and Democrats, every time they come in, they try to make sure that the stock market grows, that companies are allowed to spend trillions of dollars buying back their own stocks instead of investing in factories to provide jobs for people. They're pumping up this big bubble of speculation that makes the rich richer. And again, real estate. Why can no one afford a house or an apartment? Because housing in the U.S. is a speculative asset. In fact, it was in China, President Xi Jinping said famously, houses are for living in, not for speculation. That's why the Chinese government decided to pop the real estate bubble to make housing more affordable for people. The U.S. could learn a lot from that lesson. So getting back to Jake Sullivan, what is the response to this? So he does recognize that neoliberalism resulted in all these issues. However, their solution is economic war with China. Now, of course, Sullivan is a Democrat. He was Hillary Clinton's top advisor. Now he's one of the most powerful people in the U.S. government. And basically, he is the kind of mastermind of what some of Biden's supporters call so-called Bidenomics. What really that means is they're trying to revive industrial policy, which means using the government, but not through state ownership, but rather through subsidies and benefits to try to encourage private companies to invest in manufacturing production in the United States. So the Biden administration passed its landmark legislation, which is called the Inflation Reduction Act. And there are estimates, including by Goldman Sachs economists, that this will result in trillions of dollars of investment in certain strategic sectors like green energy in the US. Now, the irony is that they already have faced many issues because once you deindustrialize, you can't just magically reindustrialize overnight. They've lost all the supply chain. They have horrible infrastructure, which is collapsing around people in the US because the US government has not invested in infrastructure. They don't have skilled workers because obviously for decades there have not been good manufacturing jobs. They were sent abroad by the greed of US companies. So they don't have skilled workers who know how to create these products. So the irony is the US government is giving billions of dollars of subsidies, to instance, to TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, to send Taiwanese workers to the US to build these semiconductors because the US doesn't want mainland China to be able to compete with semiconductors. So this is Jake Sullivan's response. It claims to be like a return to this kind of Keynesianism and industrial policy that recognizes that the state must play a role, that we can't rely on the free market to do everything. But in reality, all they're actually doing is pumping in trillions of dollars of government money and subsidies and support to private companies, including foreign companies, ironically, and they can't even reindustrialize because, as I said, the problems of reindustrialization the problems that caused deindustrialization is not simply because wages were lower in other countries. It's also because the US system is designed in a way that makes it impossible for working people to actually produce goods and have a living wage and pay for healthcare and pay for housing and pay for childcare, because the cost of everything is so expensive, because it needs to be inflated to protect the wealth of the capitalist class in the US and capitalists around the world who hold their wealth in the form of US assets. So the US government has to decide, will we decide, we're in a class war, the capitalists have been winning for decades, will we decide that we will have to take actions against the capitalists and try to make the cost of living more affordable, which would make manufacturing capabilities actually possible to bring back manufacturing jobs? Or will we continue pumping up these asset bubbles that make the rich richer? And of course, Jake Sullivan can claim that he wants to reindustrialize. Marco Rubio is now even using this ridiculous rhetoric, this horrible neocon. But in reality, these politicians are beholden to the very same corporations and financial interests who benefit from those policies. And I do not think for a second that they're actually going to resist these companies. So we see this rhetoric from people like Jake Sullivan, but you know what actually is the result? At the end of the day, most mainstream economists recognize that this isn't going to work. Instead, the US is calling for friend-shoring. So they recognize that they can't really reindustrialize the US and deal with this problem. So instead, they're going to send those manufacturing jobs to Mexico, to Indonesia, to India, and not China. They're going to friend-shore, which doesn't solve the problem of deindustrialization in the US. It doesn't bring back good jobs.
Absolutely, Ben. I was just thinking of what Tim Cook once said regarding for that specific part of skilled labor. He said that if I wanted to find tooling engineers, I would have difficulty filling a conference room. Whereas if I go to China, I can fill stadiums with tooling engineers. I think that's another way in which China has developed and built its public infrastructure in terms of its education. But I wanted to come back to this notion of class war. I live in the Oakland area. The Oakland area has 1,600 campsites for the homeless. They're being taken down right now, but there are over 1,600. Everywhere you turn, you will see human misery on a level that, that is like what you would see in the poorest of the third world. Now, when I see homeless people, I don't think of them as unhoused. I think of them as refugees or IDPs from a class war. That is literally what they are. And during the period that from the 1970s until the current moment, U.S. wages for your average worker have remained stagnant for over 5 decades. And during that same period, China's salaries of your average worker have increased 6, 7, 8, tenfold. And so that shows that there's something very, very profoundly different going on. But I just want to tap that in also with this lie that when people say China stole your jobs, it's not shorthand for saying we became less competitive and based on global labor arbitration and fluid transnational capital markets investment, and therefore jobs were moved to a more competitive locale. That's not what they're saying. They're saying that that job was yours and those Chinese stole it. Those Chinese stole your livelihood. And this is the kind of hatred that we saw in many times in history, in particular in the 19th century, when white people lynched the Chinese for, quote unquote, taking their jobs, and when entire Chinatowns were torched. And so if you could say a few words about, the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing and how it's being used in this global competition and escalation against China.
Well, this is what the capitalist class always does. They try to scapegoat, first of all, oppressed nations inside the country, scapegoat Black Americans, scapegoat immigrants, and then they scapegoat foreign powers. So, of course, China is the latest scapegoat, but of course, during the first Cold War, it was the Soviet Union and whatever. It constantly changes. But the point that people need to understand is that U.S. corporations act to benefit their shareholders. They actually are contractually obligated to maximize returns for shareholders. Who are the shareholders? They're the rich. They are wealthy people who, instead of making their money from wages, they make their money through investments and inheritance. And if you want to be really rich, you don't work, you invest, or you actually inherit a lot of money from someone who's already rich. That's actually the easiest way, right? But if you want to be very, very rich, and the problem is that the US economy is built on this international division of labor. Of course, we know that within every capitalist country, there's this division of labor, and there are people who are exploited. So there obviously is a lot of exploitation of workers in the US who are not paid well. And again, the cost of living is so prohibitively expensive because the cost of living has been inflated in order to protect the wealth of capitalists, that it makes it, even if you got better wages, if your housing prices keep going up, if healthcare costs keep going up, it doesn't matter if your wages increase, because in reality, your real wages are not increasing because they're not keeping up with inflation, right? But it's not just that. There's also an international division of labor. And in the neoliberal era, when all capital controls were lifted, and capital, which became more and more abstracted. What is capital? It's dead labor, right? But it's become more and more abstracted. And like I said, it's no longer even the physical cash, right? Which is an IOU, right? Or a government bond, which is a debt, or a corporate bond, government debt, which rich people invest in. It's no longer just that. It's so abstracted now that it's all numbers on a computer screen, and immediately a bank can collapse in one day from a bank run, like we saw, famously the photos of people during the Great Depression. In the 1930s, there were these bank runs that happened over a few weeks, right? Well, a bank like Silicon Valley Bank can crash in one day because it's so easy to move capital across borders with a computer screen, with your phone. And in the neoliberal era, when governments in the West lifted capital controls, and then they forced other countries around the world, often at the barrel of a gun, often through IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs. They forced them to lift capital controls, claiming foreign investment's going to help you. But this is not actually, the vast majority of that investment was not in factories to provide manufacturing jobs. It was in speculative financial assets, and these created these big bubbles that famously led to the 1997 Asian financial crisis, after Korea and some Southeast Asian nations lifted capital controls. It famously led to the dot-com bubble in 2000 in the US. It led to the financial crisis of 2008. I mean, we've seen crisis after crisis after crisis. And so what happens is that there's basically no way to actually prevent these capitalists from moving their wealth all around the world. They stash their wealth also in offshore tax shelters in the Cayman Islands and the Virgin Islands. So what we see is this economy in the US that these capitalists, they deindustrialized everything, and then the US economy became a big financial bubble. If you want to be rich, if you look at all the big billionaires, almost none of them became rich through actually producing tangible products that people want for a better life. They became rich through investing in the stock market, financial derivatives, that is gambling. They became rich through currency speculation. They became rich through arbitrage. That's how you become rich, right? You become a financial capitalist. You develop some kind of monopoly. You charge monopoly rents. You extract the surplus value produced by people around the world. You don't actually produce things. So again, this is all getting back to this issue that you were talking about earlier. People can scapegoat China. People can scapegoat workers in Honduras, workers in Kenya, whatever. But the reality is that the US economy in the neoliberal era was developed, it was constructed in a way that basically makes it impossible for manufacturing production to be done locally. It was not China that did that. It was not Honduras that did that. It was the US capitalist class and the US politicians whom they fund that decided we're going to be the banker of the world. We're not going to be the factory of the world. China will be the factory of the world. We'll print debt and we'll use those dollars and import products produced by China. It wasn't US workers who said, yeah, we're going to get rid of our jobs and instead we'll just have cheap products from China, which, by the way, is one of the reasons that inflation was so low in the past few decades in the neoliberal era. We're told that it was because of all these productivity gains. No, it was precisely because of outsourcing. But now we're at the point where the U.S. is tariffing China. It's talking about bringing back manufacturing. And we're going to see a return of inflation, which, once again, inflation, if it's not dealt with in a way that means that wages are indexed to increase with inflation, it's going to be yet another class war that means that real wages are going to keep falling in the name of economic war in China. So again, the problem is the US government and the capitalists who fund it do not prioritize working people. Their priority is inflating the wealth of the capitalists who fund them. Until that central contradiction is dealt with, people can scapegoat China, people can scapegoat whoever they want. It doesn't solve the problem. That's the only way to solve the problem.
Well, Ben, it's always a pleasure talking to you. You're a wealth of knowledge, and I encourage anyone, if this is your first time seeing a Ben Norton interview, definitely go check out his work at Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben, thanks again for joining the China Report today.
Thanks so much for having me. I love Breakthrough. I love your new show, and I'll see you all soon, hopefully.
Well, to end this week's episode, we have a Red Scare of the Week doubleheader. First, on Friday, House Republicans launched an investigation into Minnesota Governor and newly appointed VP pick Tim Walz over his connections to China. Walz taught English in China in 1989 as part of a Harvard Teach Abroad program, and later on, he ran a program with his wife which coordinated trips to China. In a letter to the FBI urging the probe into Walz, House Oversight and Accountability Committee Chairman James Comer said Walz himself has admitted that he doesn't believe we need to have an adversarial relationship with China. So, KJ, I'm sure you've seen this story. The investigation was launched Friday, and what's really striking to me is that you can be suspect now, even if you say that we should have peaceful relations with China. We should have a cooperative relationship with China. We shouldn't have an adversarial relationship with China, as Tim Walz said. So we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on this story.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to note that Tim Walz actually has been pretty belligerent towards China in terms of the legislation he has approved regarding Xinjiang, regarding Hong Kong, etc. So legislatively, the record is pretty clear, but they're taking, even the mildest, slightest statement of non-contention as something to be investigated and something incredibly suspect. It shows you the time that we are in, the moment that we are in that you are supposed to profess to an unconditional hatred and aggression towards China. If not, you are automatically suspect. I was just reading an article in Foreign Policy by Robert Kelly, and he says the China hawk's faith in Trump is delusional. He's saying that Trump is not going to be aggressive enough against China, and the China hawks should not trust him on that. Just the framing of that is quite astonishing.
Well, as we've discussed on this show before, war on China is a bipartisan affair in which Republicans and Democrats are both engaged in. Not to be outdone, we're going to leave you with this political ad that Democratic Congressman from New Mexico, Martin Heinrich, recently released, which targets his Republican opponent. Again, this ad was released by a Democrat. And it's about her supposed ties to China. And I think this ad speaks for itself. And we'll see you next week on the China Report.
Given the choice, who did Nella Domenici stand with? The Chinese Communist Party, 1,000,000 times over. Nella served as CFO of hedge fund Bridgewater, which invested millions of dollars into companies building China's fighter jets, bombers, and aircraft carriers. Weapons of war that can be turned on America. Our national security traded for her personal gain. Nella Domenici already chose a side, and it wasn't ours.
I'm Martin Heinrich, and I approve this message.